This is a continuation of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, comprising Part 2, Chapters 8 through 12.
Part 2, Chapter 8. My memory goes back to a strange night in Ypres in those early days. It was Gullet, the Australian eyewitness, afterward in Palestine, who had the idea. It would be a great adventure, he said, as we stood listening to the gun fire over there. It would be damn silly, said a staff officer. Only a stern sense of duty would make me do it. It was Gullet who was the brave man. We took a bottle of Cointreau and a sweet cake as a gift to any battalion mess we might find in the ramparts, and were sorry for ourselves when we failed to find it, nor, for a long time, any living soul. Our own footsteps were the noisiest sounds as we stumbled over the broken stones. No other footstep paced down any of those streets of shattered houses through which we wandered with tightened nerves. There was no movement among all those rubbish heaps of fallen masonry and twisted iron. We were in the loneliness of a sepulchre which had been once a fair city. For a little while my friend and I stood in the grand place, not speaking. In the deepening twilight, beneath the last flame feathers of the sinking sun and the first stars that glimmered in a pale sky, the frightful beauty of the ruins put a spell upon us. The tower of the cathedral rose high above the framework of broken arches and single pillars, like a white rock which had been split from end to end by a thunderbolt. A recent shell had torn out a slice, so that the top of the tower was supported only upon broken buttresses, and the great pile was hollowed out like a decayed tooth. The cloth hall was but a skeleton in stone, with immense gaunt ribs about the dead carcass of its former majesty. Beyond, the Tower of St. Mark's was a stark ruin, which gleamed white through the darkening twilight. We felt as men who should stand gazing upon the ruins of Westminster Abbey, while the shadows of night crept into their dark caverns and into their yawning chasms of chaotic masonry, with a gleam of moon upon their riven towers and fingers of pale light touching the ribs of isolated arches. In the spaciousness of the grand place at Ypres, my friend, and I stood like the last men on earth in a city of buried life. It was almost dark now as we made our way through other streets of rubbish heaps. Strangely enough, as I remember, many of the iron lamp posts had been left standing, though bent and twisted in a drunken way, and here and there we caught the sweet whiff of flowers and plants, still growing in gardens which had not been utterly destroyed by the daily tempest of shells, though the houses about them had been all wrecked. The woods below the ramparts were slashed and torn by these storms, and in the darkness, lightened faintly by the crescent moon, we stumbled over broken branches and innumerable shell holes. The silence was broken now by the roar of a gun, which sounded so loud that I jumped sideways with the sudden shock of it. It seemed to be the signal for our batteries, and shell after shell went rushing through the night, with that long, menacing hiss which ends in a dull blast. The reports of the guns and the explosions of the shells followed each other, and mingled in an enormous tumult, echoed back by the ruins of Ypres in hollow, reverberating thunder strokes. The enemy was answering back, not very fiercely yet, and from the center of the town, in or about the grand place, came the noise of falling houses or of huge blocks of stones stoning into fragments. We groped along, scared with the sense of death around us. The first flares of the night were being lighted by both sides above their trenches on each side of the salient. The balls of light rose into the velvety darkness, and a moment later suffused the sky with a white glare which faded away tremulously after half a minute. Against the first vivid brightness of it, the lines of trees along the roads to Hooge were silhouetted as black as ink, and the fields between Ypres and the trenches were flooded with a milky luminance. The whole shape of the salient was revealed to us in those flashes. We could see all those places for which our soldiers fought and died. We stared across the fields beyond the Menin road toward the Hooge crater, and those trenches which were battered to pieces, but not abandoned in the first battle of Ypres and the second battle. That salient was, even then, in 1915, a graveyard of British soldiers. There were years to follow, when many more would lie there, and as between flash and flash the scene was revealed, I seemed to see a great army of ghosts, the spirits of all those boys who had died on this ground. It was the darkness and the tumult of guns and our loneliness here on the ramparts which put an edge to my nerves and made me see unnatural things. No wonder a sentry was startled when he saw our two figures approaching him through a clump of trees. His words rang out like pistol shots. "Halt! Who goes there?" "Friends," we shouted, seeing the gleam of light on a shaking bayonet. "Come close to be recognized," he said, and his voice was harsh. We went close, and I for one was afraid. Young sentries sometimes shot too soon. "Who are you?" he asked, in a more natural voice, and when we explained he laughed gruffly. I never saw two strangers pass this way before. He was an old soldier, back to the army again, with Kitchener's men. He had been in the Chitral campaign and South Africa little wars compared to this, as he said. A fine, simple man, and although a bricklayer's labourer in private life, with a knowledge of the right word. I was struck when he said that the German flares were more luminous than ours. I could hardly see his face in the darkness, except when he struck a match once, but his figure was black against the illumined sky, and I watched the motion of his arm as he pointed to the roads up which his comrades had gone to the support of another battalion at Hooge, who were hard pressed. They went along under a lot of shrapnel and had many casualties. He told the story of that night in a quiet, thoughtful way, with phrases of almost biblical beauty in their simple truth, and the soul of the man, the spirit of the whole army in which he was a private soldier, was revealed when he flashed out a sentence with his one note of fire. "But the enemy lost more than we did, sir," that night. We wandered away again into the darkness, with the din of the bombardment all about us. There was not a square yard of ground unploughed by shells, and we did not nourish any false illusions as to finding a safe spot for a bivouac. There was no spot within the ramparts of Ypres where a man might say no shells will fall here, but one place we found where there seemed some reasonable odds of safety. There also, if sleep assailed us, we might curl up in an abandoned dugout and hope that it would not be crumped before the dawn. There were several of these shelters there, but peering into them by the light of a match, I shuddered at the idea of lying in one of them. They had been long out of use, and there was a foul look about the damp bedding and rugs which had been left to rot there. They were inhabited already by half-wild cats, the abandoned cats of Ypres, which hunted mice through the ruins of their old houses, and they spat at me and glared with green-eyed fear as I thrust a match into their lairs. There were 2 kitchen chairs, with a deal table on which we put our cake and cointreau, and here, through half a night, my friend and I sat watching and listening to that weird scene upon which the old moon looked down, and, as 2 men will at such a time, we talked over all the problems of life and death, and the meaning of man's heritage. Another sentry challenged us, all his nerves jangled at our apparition. He was a young fellow, one of Kitchener's crowd, and told us frankly that he had the jim-jums in this solitude of Ypres and saw Germans every time a rat jumped. He lingered near us for company. It was becoming chilly. The dew made our clothes damp. Cake and sweet liquor were poor provisions for the night, and the thought of hot tea was infinitely seductive. Perhaps somewhere one might find a few soldiers round a kettle in some friendly dugout. We groped our way along, holding our breath at times as a shell came sweeping overhead or burst with a sputter of steel against the ramparts. It was profoundly dark, so that only the glowworms glittered like jewels on black velvet. The moon had gone down, and inside Ypres the light of the distant flares only glimmered faintly above the broken walls. In a tunnel of darkness voices were speaking, and someone was whistling softly, and a gleam of red light made a bar across the grass. We walked toward a group of black figures, suddenly silent at our approach, obviously startled. "Who's there?" said a voice. We were just in time for tea, a stroke of luck with a company of boys, all Kitchener lads from the civil service, who were spending the night here. They had made a fire behind a screen to give them a little comfort and frighten off the ghosts, and gossiped with a queer sense of humour, cynical and blasphemous, but even through their jokes there was a yearning for the end of a business which was too close to death. I remember the gist of their conversation, which was partly devised for my benefit. One boy declared that he was sick of the whole business. "I should like to cancel my contract," he remarked. "Yes, send in your resignation, old lad," said another, with ironical laughter. "They'd consider it, wouldn't they? P-Raps offer a rise in wages, I don't think." Another boy said, "I am a citizen of no mean empire, but what the hell is the empire going to do for me when the next shell blows off both my bleeding legs?" This remark was also received by a gust of subdued laughter, silenced for a moment by a roar and upheaval of masonry somewhere by the ruins of the Cloth Hall. "Soldiers are prisoners," said a boy without any trace of humour. "You're lagged and you can't escape. A blighty is the best luck you can hope for." "I don't want to kill Germans," said a fellow with a superior accent. "I've no personal quarrel against them, and anyhow I don't like butcher's work." Christian service, that's what the padre calls it. I wonder if Christ would have stuck a bayonet into a German stomach, a German with his hands up. That's what we're asked to do. "Oh, Christianity is out of business, my child. Why mention it? This is war, and we're back to the primitive state BC. All the same, I say my little prayers when I'm in a blue funk. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, look upon a little child. This last remark was the prize joke of the evening, received with much hilarity, not too loud, for fear of drawing fire, though really no Germans could have heard any laughter in Ypres. Nearby, their officer was spending the night. We called on him, and found him sitting alone in a dugout furnished by odd bits from the wrecked houses, with waxen flowers in a glass case on the shelf, and an old cottage clock which ticked out the night, and a velvet armchair which had been the pride of a Flemish home. He was a Devonshire lad, with a pale, thoughtful face, and I was sorry for him in his loneliness, with a roof over his head, which would be no proof against a fair-sized shell. He expressed no surprise at seeing us. I think he would not have been surprised if the ghost of Edward the Black Prince had called on him. He would have greeted him with the same politeness and offered him his green armchair. The night passed. The guns slackened down before the dawn. For a little while there was almost silence, even over the trenches. But as the first faint glow of dawn crept through the darkness, the rifle fire burst out again feverishly, and the machine guns clucked with new spasms of ferocity. The boys of the new army, and the Germans facing them, had an attack of the nerves, as always at that hour. The flares were still rising, but had the debauched look of belated fireworks after a night of orgy. In a distant field a cock crew. The dawn lightened all the sky, and the shadows crept away from the ruins of Ypres, and all the ghastly wreckage of the city was revealed again nakedly. Then the guns ceased for a while, and there was quietude in the trenches, and out of Ypres, sneaking by sideways, went two tired figures, padding the hoof with a slouching swiftness to escape the early morning hate, which was sure to come as soon as a clock in Vlamertinghe, still working in a ruined tower, chimed the hour of 6. I went through Ypres scores of times afterward, and during the battles of Flanders saw it day by day, as columns of men and guns and pack mules and transports went up toward the ridge, which led at last to Passchendaele. We had big guns in the ruins of Ypres, and round about, and they fired with violent concussions which shook loose stones, and their flashes were red through the Flanders mist. Always this capital of the battlefields was sinister, with the sense of menace about. Steel helmets to be worn, gas masks at the alert. So said the traffic man at the crossroads. As one strapped on one's steel helmet and shortened the strap of one's gas mask, the spirit of Ypres touched one's soul icily. Part 2, Chapter 9. The worst school of war for the sons of gentlemen was, in those early days, and for long afterward, huge. That was the devil's playground, and his chamber of horrors, wherein he devised merry tortures for young Christian men. It was not far out of Ypres, to the left of the Menin road, and to the north of Zouave Wood and Sanctuary Wood. For a time there was a chateau there, called the White Chateau, with excellent stables and good accommodation for one of our brigade staffs, until one of our generals was killed and others wounded by a shell, which broke up their conference. Afterward there was no chateau, but only a rubble of bricks banked up with sandbags and deep mine craters filled with stinking water slopping over from the Bellewaerde Lake and low-lying pools. Bodies, and bits of bodies, and clots of blood, and green metallic-looking slime, made by explosive gases, were floating on the surface of that water below the crater banks when I first passed that way, and so it was always. Our men lived there and died there, within a few yards of the enemy, crouched below the sandbags and burrowed in the sides of the crater. Lice crawled over them in legions. Human flesh, rotting and stinking, mere pulp, was pasted into the mud banks. If they dug to get deeper cover, their shovels went into the softness of dead bodies who had been their comrades. Scraps of flesh, booted legs, blackened hands, eyeless heads, came falling over them when the enemy trench mortared their position or blew up a new mine shaft. I remember one young Irish officer who came down to Burr quarters on a brief respite from commanding the garrison at Hooge. He was a handsome fellow, like young Philip of Spain by Velasquez, and he had a profound melancholy in his eyes in spite of a charming smile. "Do you mind if I have a bath before I join you?" he asked. He walked about in the open air until the bath was ready. Even there a strong, fetid smell came from him. "Hooge," he said, in a thoughtful way, "is not a health resort." He was more cheerful after his bath, and did not feel quite such a leper. He told one or two stories about the things that happened at Hooge, and I wondered if hell could be so bad. After a short stay he went back again, and I could see that he expected to be killed. Before saying goodbye, he touched some flowers on the mess table, and for a moment or two, listened to birds twittering in the trees. "Thanks very much," he said. "I've enjoyed this visit a good deal. Goodbye." He went back through Ypres on the way to Hooge, and the mine crater where his Irish soldiers were lying in slime, in which vermin crawled. Sometimes it was the enemy who mined under our position, blowing a few men to bits and scattering the sandbags. Sometimes it was our men who upheaved the earth beyond them by mine charges and rushed the new crater. It was in July of 15 that the devils of Hooge became merry and bright with increased activity. The Germans had taken possession of one of the mine craters which formed the apex of a triangle across the Menin Road, with trenches running down to it on either side, so that it was like the spearhead of their position. They had fortified it with sandbags and crammed it with machine guns, which could sweep the ground on three sides, so making a direct attack by infantry a suicidal enterprise. Our trenches immediately faced this stronghold from the other side of a road at right angles with the Menin Road, and our men, the New Army boys, were shelled day and night, so that many of them were torn to pieces, and others buried alive, and others sent mad by shell shock. They were learning their lessons in the School of Courage. It was decided by a conference of generals, not at Hooge, to clear out this hornet's nest, and the job was given to the sappers, who mined under the roadway toward the redoubt, while our heavy artillery shelled the enemy's position all around the neighborhood. On July 22d the mine was exploded, while our men crouched low, horribly afraid after hours of suspense. The earth was rent asunder by a gust of flame, and vomited up a tumult of soil and stones and human limbs and bodies. Our men still crouched while these things fell upon them. "I thought I had been blown to bits," one of them told me. "I was a quaking fear, with my head in the earth. I kept saying, 'Christ, Christ.'" When the earth and smoke had settled again, it was seen that the enemy's redoubt had ceased to exist. In its place, where there had been a crisscross of trenches and sandbag shelters for their machine guns and a network of barbed wire, there was now an enormous crater, hollowed deep with shelving sides, surrounded by tumbled earth heaps which had blocked up the enemy's trenches on either side of the position, so that they could not rush into the cavern and take possession. It was our men who rushed the crater and lay there panting in its smoking soil. Our generals had asked for trouble when they destroyed that redoubt, and our men had it. Infuriated by a massacre of their garrison in the mine explosion and by the loss of their spearhead, the Germans kept up a furious bombardment on our trenches in that neighborhood in bursts of gun fire, which tossed our earthworks about and killed and wounded many men. Our line at Hooge at that time was held by the King's Royal Rifles of the 14th Division, young fellows not far advanced in the training school of war. They held on under the gunning of their positions, and each man among them wondered whether it was the shells screeching overhead or the next which would smash him into pulp, like those bodies lying nearby in dugouts and upheaved earthworks. On the morning of July 30th, there was a strange lull of silence after a heavy bout of shells and mortars. Men of the K.R.R. raised their heads above broken parapets and crawled out of shell holes and looked about. There were many dead bodies lying around, and wounded men were wailing. The unwounded, startled by the silence, became aware of some moisture falling on them, thick, oily drops of liquid. "What in hell's name?" said a subaltern. One man smelled his clothes, which reeked of something like paraffin. Coming across from the German trenches were men hunched up under some heavy weights. They were carrying cylinders with nozzles like hose pipes. Suddenly there was a rushing noise like an escape of air from some blast furnace. Long tongues of flame licked across to the broken ground where the King's Royal Rifles lay. Some of them were set on fire, their clothes burning on them, making them living torches, and in a second or two cinders. It was a new horror of war, the Flammenwerfer. Some of the men leaped to their feet, cursing, and fired repeatedly at the Germans carrying the flaming jets. Here and there the shots were true. A man hunched under a cylinder exploded like a fat moth caught in a candle flame. But that advancing line of fire, after the long bombardment, was too much for the rank and file, whose clothes were smoking and whose bodies were scorched. In something like a panic they fell back, abandoning the cratered ground in which their dead lay. The news of this disaster and of the new horror reached the troops in reserve, who had been resting in the rear after a long spell. They moved up at once to support their comrades and make a counterattack. The ground they had to cover was swept by machine guns, and many fell, but the others attacked again and again, regardless of their losses, and won back part of the lost ground, leaving only a depth of 500 yards in the enemy's hands. So the position remained until the morning of August 9th, when a new attack was begun by the Durham, Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Midland troops of the 6th Division, who had been long in the salient and had proved the quality of northern grit in the foul places and the foul weather of that region. It was late on the night of August 8th that these battalions took up their position, ready for the assault. These men, who came mostly from mines and workshops, were hard and steady and did not show any outward sign of nervousness, though they knew well enough that before the light of another day came their numbers would have passed through the lottery of this game of death. Each man's life depended on no more than a fluke of luck, by the throw of those dice which explode as they fall. They knew what their job was. It was to cross 500 yards of open ground, to capture, and to hold a certain part of the German position near the Chateau of Hooge. They were at the apex of the triangle which made a German salient after the ground was lost, on July 30th. On the left side of the triangle was Zoo of Wood, and Sanctuary Wood ran up the right side to a strong fort held by the enemy and crammed with machine guns and every kind of bomb. The base of the upturned triangle was made by the Menin Road to the north, beyond which lay the crater, the chateau, and the stables. The way that lay between the regiment and their goal was not an easy one to pass. It was cut and cross-cut by our old trenches, now held by the enemy, who had made tangles of barbed wire in front of their parapets and had placed machine guns at various points. The ground was littered with dead bodies belonging to the Battle of July 30th, and pock-marked by deep shell holes. To cross 500 yards of such ground, in the storm of the enemy's fire, would be an ordeal greater than that of rushing from one trench to another. It would have to be done in regular attack formation, and with the best of luck would be a grim and costly progress. The night was pitch dark. The men drawn up could only see one another as shadows blacker than the night. They were very quiet. Each man was fighting down his fear in his soul, trying to get a grip on nerves hideously strained by the rack of this suspense. The words "steady, lads" were spoken down the ranks by young lieutenants and sergeants. The sounds of men whispering, a cough here and there, a word of command, the clink of bayonets, the cracking of twigs under heavy boots, the shuffle of troops getting into line, would not carry with any loudness to German ears. The men deployed before dawn broke, waiting for the preliminary bombardment which would smash a way for them. The officers struck matches now and then to glance at their wrist watches, set very carefully to those of the gunners. Then our artillery burst forth with an enormous violence of shell fire, so that the night was shattered with the tumult of it. Guns of every caliber mingled their explosions, and the long screech of the shells rushed through the air, as though thousands of engines were chasing one another madly through a vast junction in that black vault. The men listened and waited. As soon as the guns lengthened their fuses, the infantry advance would begin. Their nerves were getting jangled. It was just the torture of human animals. There was an indrawing of breath when suddenly the enemy began to fire rockets, sending up flares which made white waves of light. If they were seen, there would be a shambles. But the smoke of all the bursting shells rolled up in a thick veil, hiding those mining lads who stared toward the illuminations above the black vapors, and at the flashes which seemed to stab great rents in the pall of smoke. It was a jumpy moment, said the colonel of the Durhams, and the moment lengthened into minutes. Then the time came. The watch hands pointed to the second which had been given for the assault to begin, and instantly, to the tick, the guns lifted and made a curtain of fire round the Chateau of Hooge, beyond the Menin Road, 600 yards away. Time. The company officers blew their whistles, and there was a sudden clatter from trench spades slung to rifle barrels, and from men girdled with hand grenades, as the advancing companies deployed and made their first rush forward. The ground had been churned up by our shells, and the trenches had been battered into shapelessness, strewn with broken wire and heaps of loose stones and fragments of steel. It seemed impossible that any German should be left alive in this quagmire, but there was still a rattle of machine guns from holes and hillocks. Not for long. The bombing parties searched and found them and silenced them. From the heaps of earth which had once been trenches, German soldiers rose and staggered in a dazed, drunken way, stupefied by the bombardment beneath which they had crouched. Our men spitted them on their bayonets or hurled hand grenades and swept the ground before them. Some Germans screeched like pigs in a slaughterhouse. The men went on in short rushes. They were across the Menin Road now, and were first to the crater, though other troops were advancing quickly from the left. They went down into the crater, shouting hoarsely, and hurling bombs at Germans who were caught like rats in a trap, and scurried up the steep sides beyond, firing before rolling down again, until at least 200 bodies lay dead at the bottom of this pit of hell. While some of the men dug themselves into the crater or held the dugouts already made by the enemy, others climbed up to the ridge beyond, and with a final rush, almost winded and spent, reached the extreme limit of their line of assault and achieved the task which had been set them. They were mad now, not human in their senses. They saw red through bloodshot eyes. They were beasts of prey, these decent Yorkshire lads. Round the stables themselves, 300 Germans were bay-wanted, until not a single enemy lived on this ground. And the light of day on that 9th of August revealed a bloody and terrible scene, not decent for words to tell. Not decent, but a shambles of human flesh which had been a panic-stricken crowd of living men crying for mercy, with that dreadful screech of terror from German boys who saw the white gleam of steel at their stomachs before they were spitted. Not many of those Durham and Yorkshire lads remain alive now with that memory. The few who do must have thrust it out of their vision, unless at night it haunts them. The assaulting battalion had lost many men during the assault, but their main ordeal came after the first advance, when the German guns belched out a large quantity of heavy shells from the direction of Hill 60. They raked the ground and tried to make our men yield the position they had gained, but they would not go back or crawl away from their dead. All through the day the bombardment continued, answered from our side by 14 hours of concentrated fire, which I watched from our battery positions. In spite of the difficulties of getting up supplies through the crumped trenches, the men held on and consolidated their positions. One of the most astounding feats was done by the sappers, who put up barbed wire beyond the line under a devilish cannonade. A telephone operator had had his apparatus smashed by a shell early in the action, and worked his way back to get another. He succeeded in reaching the advanced line again, but another shell knocked out his second instrument. It was then only possible to keep in touch with the battalion headquarters by means of messengers, and again officers and men made their way across the zone of fire or died in the attempt. Messages reached the colonel of the regiment that part of his front trenches had been blown away. From other parts of the line reports came in that the enemy was preparing a counter-attack. For several hours now the colonel of the Durhams could not get into touch with his companies, isolated and hidden beneath the smoke of the shell bursts. Flag wagging and heliographing were out of the question. He could not tell even if a single man remained alive out there beneath all those shells. No word came from them now to let him know if the enemy were counter-attacking. Early in the afternoon he decided to go out and make his own reconnaissance. The bombardment was still relentless, and it was only possible to go part of the way in an old communication trench. The ground about was littered with the dead, still being blown about by high explosives. The soul of the colonel was heavy then with doubt, and with the knowledge that most of the dead here were his own. When he told me this adventure, his only comment was the soldier's phrase. It was not what might be called a healthy place. He could see no sign of a counterattack, but straining through the smoke clouds, his eyes could detect no sign of life where his men had been holding the captured lines. Were they all dead out there? On Monday night, the colonel was told that his battalion would be relieved, and managed to send this order to a part of it. It was sent through by various routes, but some men who carried it came back with the news that it was still impossible to get into touch with the companies holding the advanced positions above the Menin Road. In trying to do so, they had had astounding escapes. Several of them had been blown as far as 10 yards by the air pressure of exploding shells and had been buried in the scatter of earth. When at last my men came back, those of them who had received the order, said the colonel, I knew the price of their achievement, its cost in officers and men. He spoke as a man resentful of that bloody sacrifice. There were other men still alive and still holding on. With some of them were 4 young officers who clung to their ground all through the next night before being relieved. They were without a drop of water and suffered the extreme miseries of the battlefield. There was no distinction in courage between those 4 men, but the greatest share of suffering was borne by one. Early in the day he had had his jaw broken by a piece of shell, but still led his men. Later in the day he was wounded in the shoulder and leg, but kept his command, and he was still leading the survivors of his company when he came back on the morning of Tuesday, August 10th. Another party of men had even a longer time of trial. They were under the command of a lance corporal, who had gained possession of the stables above the Menin Road and now defended their ruins. During the previous 24 hours he had managed to send through several messages, but they were not to report his exposed position, nor to ask for supports, nor to request relief. What he said each time was, "Send us more bombs." It was only at 7:30 in the morning of Tuesday, after 30 hours under shell fire, that the survivors came away from their rubbish heap in the lines of death. So it was at Hooge on that day of August. I talked with these men, touched hands with them while the mud and blood of the business still fouled them. Even now, in remembrance, I wonder how men could go through such hours without having on their faces more traces of their hell, though some of them were still shaking with a kind of ague. Part 2, Chapter 10. Here and there on the roadsides behind the lines queer sacks hung from wooden poles. They had round, red discs painted on them, and looked like the trunks of human bodies after Red Indians had been doing decorative work with their enemies slain. At Flixecourt, near Amiens, I passed one on a Sunday when bells were ringing for high mass and a crowd of young soldiers were trooping into the field with fixed bayonets. A friend of mine, an ironical fellow, nudged me and said, "Sunday school for young Christians," and made a hideous face, very comical. It was a bayonet school of instruction, and O.C. Bayonet's Colonel Ronald Campbell was giving a little demonstration. It was a curiously interesting form of exercise. It was as though the primitive nature in man, which had been sleeping through the centuries, was suddenly awakened in the souls of these Cockney soldier boys. They made sudden jabs at one another fiercely and with savage grimaces, leapt at men standing with their backs turned, who wheeled round sharply and crossed bayonets and taunted the attackers. Then they lunged at the hanging sacks, stabbing them where the red circles were painted. These inanimate things became revoltingly lifelike as they jerked to and fro, and the bayonet men seemed enraged with them. One fell from the rope, and a boy sprang at it, dug his bayonet in, put his foot on the prostrate thing to get a purchase for the bayonet, which he lugged out again, and then kicked the sack. "That's what I like to see," said an officer. "There's a fine fighting spirit in that lad. He'll kill plenty of Germans before he's done." Colonel Ronald Campbell was a great lecturer on bayonet exercise. He curdled the blood of boys with his eloquence on the method of attack, to pierce liver and lights and kidneys of the enemy. He made their eyes bulge out of their heads, fired them with bloodlust, stoked up hatred of Germans, all in a quiet, earnest, persuasive voice, and a sense of latent power and passion in him. He told funny stories, one, famous in the army, called "Where's a Rye?" It was the story of an attack on German trenches in which a crowd of Germans were captured in a dugout. The sergeant had been told to blood his men, and during the killing he turned round and asked, "Where's Ari? Ari hasn't had a go yet." Ari was a timid boy who shrank from butcher's work, but he was called up and given his man to kill, and after that Ari was like a man-eating tiger in his desire for German blood. He used another illustration in his bayonet lectures. You may meet a German who says, "Mercy, I have 10 children, kill him, he might have 10 more." At those training schools of British youth, when nature was averse to human slaughter, until very scientifically trained, one might see every form of instruction in every kind of weapon, an instrument of death, machine guns, trench mortars, bombs, torpedoes, gas, and, later on, tanks, and as the months passed, and the years, the youth of the British Empire graduated in these schools of war, and those who lived longest were experts in divers branches of technical education. Colonel Ronald Campbell retired from bayonet instruction and devoted his genius and his heart, which was bigger than the point of a bayonet, to the physical instruction of the army and the recuperation of battle-worn men. I liked him better in that job, and saw the real imagination of the man at work and his amazing, self-taught knowledge of psychology. When men came down from the trenches dazed, sullen, stupid, dismal, broken, he set to work to build up their vitality again, to get them interested in life again, and to make them keen and alert. As they had been dehumanized by war, so he rehumanized them by natural means. He had a farm with flowers and vegetables, pigs, poultry, and queer beasts. A tame bear named Flanagan was the comic character of the camp. Colonel Campbell found 1,000 qualities of character in this animal, and brought laughter back to gloomy boys by his description of them. He had names for many of his pets, the gamecocks, and the mother hens, and he taught the men to know each one, and to rear chicks, and tend flowers, and grow vegetables. Love, and not hate, was now his gospel. All his training was done by games, simple games arousing intelligence, leading up to elaborate games demanding skill of hand and eye. He challenged the whole army system of discipline imposed by authority by a new system of self-discipline based upon interest and instinct. His results were startling, and men who had been dumb, blear-eyed, dejected, shell-shocked wrecks of life were changed quite quickly into bright, cheery fellows with laughter in their eyes. "It's a pity," he said, "they have to go off again and be shot to pieces. I cure them only to be killed, but that's not my fault. It's the fault of war." It was Colonel Campbell who discovered Willie Woodbine, the fighting parson and soldier's poet, who was the leading member of a traveling troupe of thick-eared thugs. They gave pugilistic entertainments to tired men. Each of them had one thick ear. Willie Woodbine had two. They fought one another with science, as old professionals, and challenged any man in the crowd. Then one of them played the violin and drew the soul out of soldiers who seemed mere animals. And after another fight, Willie Woodbine stepped up and talked of God and war and the weakness of men and the meaning of courage. He held all those fellows in his hand, put a spell on them, kept them excited by a new revelation, gave them, poor devils, an extra touch of courage to face the menace that was ahead of them when they went to the trenches again. Part 2, Chapter 11. Our men were not always in the trenches. As the new army grew in numbers, reliefs were more frequent than in the old days when battalions held the line for long spells, until their souls as well as their bodies were sunk in squalor. Now in the summer of 1915, it was not usual for men to stay in the line for more than 3 weeks at a stretch, and they came back to camps and billets, where there was more sense of life, though still the chance of death from long-range guns. Farther back still, as far back as the coast, and all the way between the sea and the edge of war, there were new battalions quartered in French and Flemish villages, so that every cottage and farmstead, villa, and chateau was inhabited by men in khaki, who made themselves at home and established friendly relations with civilians, there unless they were too flagrant in their robbery, or too sour in their temper, or too filthy in their habits. Generally the British troops were popular in Picardy and Ottawa, and when they left, women kissed and cried, in spite of laughter, and joked in a queer jargon of English-French. In the estaminets of France and Flanders they danced with frosy peasant girls to the tune of a penny in the slot piano, or, failing the girls, danced with one another. For many years to come, perhaps for centuries, those cottages and barns into which our men crowded will retain signs and memories of that British occupation in the Great War. Boys who afterward went forward to the fighting fields and stepped across the line to the world of ghosts carved their names on wooden beams, and on the whitewashed walls scribbled legends proclaiming that Private John Johnson was a bastard, or that a certain battalion was a rabble of ruffians, or that Kaiser Bill would die on the gallows, illustrating those remarks with portraits and allegorical devices, sketchily drawn, but vivid and significant. The soldier in the house learned quite a lot of French, with which he made his needs understood by the elderly woman who cooked for his officers' mess. He could say, with a fine fluency, "Où le blooming couteau?" or "Donnez-moi le bailey fourchette, est il vous plaît, madame?" It was not beyond his vocabulary to explain that les pommes de terre frites are absolument all right if only madame will tenir ses cheveux on. In the courtyards of ancient farmhouses, so old in their timbers and gables that the Scottish bodyguard of Louis XI may have passed them on their way to Paris, modern Scots with khaki-covered kilts pumped up the water from old wells and whistled "I know a lassie" to the girl who brought the cattle home, and munched their evening rations while Sandy played a wee bit on the pipes to the peasant folk who gathered at the gate. Such good relations existed between the cottagers and their temporary guests that one day, for instance, when a young friend of mine came back from a long spell in the trenches, his conversation was of dead men, flies, bombs, lice and hell. The old lady who had given him her best bedroom at the beginning of the war flung her arms about him and greeted him like a long-lost son. To a young guardsman, with his undeveloped moustache on his upper lip, her demonstrations were embarrassing. It was one of the paradoxes of the war that beauty lived but a mile or two away from hideous squalor, while men in the lines lived in dugouts and marched down communicating trenches thigh-high, after rainy weather in mud and water, and suffered the beastliness of the primitive earthmen. Those who were out of the trenches, turn and turn about, came back to leafy villages and drilled in fields all golden with buttercups, and were not too uncomfortable in spite of overcrowding in dirty barns. There was more than comfort in some of the headquarters where our officers were billeted in French chateaux. There was a splendor of surroundings which gave a graciousness and elegance to the daily life of that extraordinary war in which men fought as brutally as in prehistoric times. I knew scores of such places, and went through gilded gates emblazoned with noble coats of arms belonging to the days of the Sun King, or farther back to the Valois, and on my visits to generals and their staff stood on long flights of steps which led up to old mansions, with many towers and turrets, surrounded by noble parks and ornamental waters, and deep barns in which 5 centuries of harvests had been stored. From one of the archways here one might see in the mind's eye man de Pompadour come out with a hawk on her wrist, or even Henri de Navarre with his gentlemen-at-arms, all their plumes alight in the sun, as they mounted their horses for a morning's boar hunt. It was surprising at first when a young British officer came out and said, "Top in morning," or "Any news from the Dardanelles?" There was something incongruous about this habitation of French chateaux by British officers with their war kit. The strangeness of it made me laugh in early days of first impressions, when I went through the rooms of one of those old historic houses, well within range of the German guns with the brigade major. It was the Château de Henencourt, near Albert. "This is the general's bedroom," said the brigade major, opening a door which led off a gallery, in which many beautiful women of France and many great nobles of the old regime looked down from their gilt frames. The general had a nice bed to sleep in. In such a bed de Barry might have stretched her arms and yawned, or the beautiful Duchesse de Mazarin might have held her morning levee. A British general with his bronzed face and bristly moustache would look a little strange under that blue silk canopy, with rosy cherubs dancing overhead on the flowered ceiling. His top boots and spurs stood next to a Louis Quinze toilet table. His leather belts and field glasses lay on the polished boards beneath the tapestry on which Venus wooed Adonis and Diana went a-hunting. In other rooms no less elegantly rose-tinted or darkly panelled other officers had made a litter of their bags, haversacks, rubber baths, trench boots, and puttees. At night the staff sat down to dinner in a salon where the portraits of a great family of France, in silks and satins and pompadour wigs, looked down upon their khaki. The owner of the chateau, in whose veins flowed the blood of those old aristocrats, was away with his regiment, in which he held the rank of corporal. His wife, the Comtesse de Henencourt, managed the estate, from which all the men servants, except the veterans, had been mobilized. In her own chateau, she kept one room for herself, and every morning came in from the dairies, where she had been working with her maids, to say, with her very gracious smile, to the invaders of her house, "Bonjour, messieurs. California va bien?" She hid any fear she had under the courage of her smile. Poor chateaux of France. German shells came to knock down their painted turrets, to smash through the ceilings where the rosy cupids played, and in 1 hour or 2 to ruin the beauty that had lived through centuries of pride. Scores of them along the line of battle were but heaps of brick dust and twisted iron. I saw the ruins of the Château de Henencourt 2 years after my first visit there. The enemy's line had come closer to it, and it was a target for their guns. Our guns, heavy and light, were firing from the backyard and neighboring fields with deafening tumult. Shells had already broken the roofs and turrets of the chateau and torn away great chunks of wall. A colonel of artillery had his headquarters in the Petit Salon. His hand trembled as he greeted me. "I'm not fond of this place," he said. "The whole damn thing will come down on my head at any time. I think I shall take to the cellars." We walked out to the courtyard, and he showed me the way down to the vault. A shell came over the chateau and burst in the outhouses. "They knocked out a 9.2 a little while ago," said the colonel. "Made a mess of some heavy gunners." There was a sense of imminent death about us, but it was not so sinister a place as farther on, where a brother of mine sat in a hole directing his battery. The Countess of Henencourt had gone. She went away with her dairymaids, driving her cattle down the roads. Part 2, Chapter 12. One of the most curious little schools of courage, inhabited by British soldiers in early days, was the village of Vaux-sur-Somme, which we took over from the French, who were our next-door neighbours at the village of Frise in the summer of '15. After the foul conditions of the salient, it seemed unreal and fantastic, with a touch of romance not found in other places. Strange as it seemed, the village garrisoned by our men was in advance of our trench lines, with nothing dividing them from the enemy, but a little undergrowth, and the queerest part of it all was the sense of safety, the ridiculously false security, with which one could wander about the village and up the footpath beyond, with the knowledge that one's movements were being watched by German eyes, and that the whole place could be blown off the face of the earth. But for the convenient fact that the Germans, who were living in the village of Curlew, beyond the footpath, were under our own observation and at the mercy of our own guns. That sounded like a fairy tale to men who, in other places, could not go over the parapet of the first-line trenches or even put their heads up for a single second without risking instant death. I stood on a hill here with a French interpreter and one of his men. A battalion of loyal North Lancashires was some distance away, but after an exchange of compliments in an idyllic glade, where a party of French soldiers lived in the friendliest juxtaposition with the British infantry surrounding them, it was a cheery bivouac among the trees, with the fragrance of a stew pot mingling with the odour of burning wood. The lieutenant insisted upon leading the way to the top of the hill. He made a slight detour to point out a German shell which had fallen there without exploding, and made laughing comments upon the harmless, futile character of those poor Germans in front of us. They did their best to kill us, but oh, so feebly. Yet when I took a pace toward the shell, he called out sharply, "Knee touches pass." I would rather have touched a sleeping tiger than that conical piece of metal with its unexploded possibilities, but bent low to see the inscriptions on it, scratched by French gunners with war recklessness of death. Mort or Boches was scrawled upon it between the men's initials. Then we came to the hill crest and to the last of our trenches, and standing there, looked down upon the villages of Vaux and Curlew, separated by a piece of marshy water. In the farthest village were the Germans, and in the nearest, just below us down the steep cliff, our own men. Between the two there was a narrow causeway across the marsh and a strip of woods half a rifle shot in length. Behind, in a sweeping semicircle round their village and ours, were the German trenches and the German guns. I looked into the streets of both villages as clearly as one may see into Clovelly village from the crest of the hill. In Vaux-sur-Somme a few British soldiers were strolling about. One was sitting on the window-sill of a cottage, kicking up his heels. In the German village of Curlew the roadways were concealed by the perspective of the houses, with their gables and chimney stacks, so that I could not see any passers-by. But at the top of the road, going out of the village and standing outside the last house on the road, was a solitary figure, a German sentry. The French lieutenant pointed to a thin mast away from the village on the hillside. "Do you see that? That is their flagstaff. They hoist their flag for victories. It wagged a good deal during the recent Russian fighting, but lately they have not had the cheek to put it up." This interpreter, the Baron de Rosen, laughed very heartily at that naked pole on the hill. Then I left him and joined our own men, and went down a steep hill into Vaux, well outside our line of trenches, and thrust forward as an outpost in the marsh. German eyes could see me as I walked. At any moment those little houses about me might have been smashed into rubbish heaps, but no shells came to disturb the waterfowl among the reeds around. And so it was that the life in this place was utterly abnormal, and while the guns were silent, except for long-range fire, an old-fashioned mode of war, what the adjutant of this little outpost called a gentlemanly warfare, prevailed. Officers and men slept within a few hundred yards of the enemy, and the officers wore their pajamas at night. When a fight took place, it was a chivalrous excursion, such as Sir Walter Manny would have liked, between 30 or 40 men on one side against somewhat the same number on the other. Our men used to steal out along the causeway which crossed the marsh, a pathway about 4 feet wide, broadening out in the middle, so that a little redoubt or blockhouse was established there, then across a narrow drawbridge, then along the path again until they came to the thicket which screened the German village of Curlew. It sometimes happened that a party of Germans were creeping forward from the other direction, in just the same way, disguised in party-coloured clothes, splashed with greens and reds and browns to make them invisible between the trees, with brown masks over their faces. Then suddenly contact was made. Into the silence of the wood came the sharp crack of rifles, the zip-zip of bullets, the shouts of men who had given up the game of invisibility. It was a sharp encounter one night when the loyal North Lancashires held the village of Vaux, and our men brought back many German helmets and other trophies as proofs of victory. Then to bed in the village, and a good night's rest, as when English knights fought the French, not far from these fields, as chronicled in the pages of that early war correspondent, Sir John Froissart. All was quiet when I went along the causeway and out into the wood, where the outposts stood listening for any crack of a twig which might betray a German footstep. I was startled when I came suddenly upon 2 men, almost invisible, against the tree trunks. There they stood, motionless, with their rifles ready, peering through the brushwood. If I had followed the path on which they stood for just a little way, I should have walked into the German village. But on the other hand, I should not have walked back again. When I left the village, and climbed up the hill to our own trenches again, I laughed aloud at the fantastic visit to that grim little outpost in the marsh. If all the war had been like this, it would have been more endurable for men who had no need to hide in holes in the earth, nor crouch for 3 months below ground, until an hour or two of massacre below a storm of high explosives. In the village on the marsh, men fought at least against other men, and not against invisible powers which belched forth death. It was part of the French system of keeping quiet until the turn of big offensives, a good system, to my mind, if not carried too far. At Fries, next door to Vaux, in a loop of the Somme, it was carried a little too far, with relaxed vigilance. It was a joke of our soldiers to crawl on and through the reeds and enter the French line and exchange souvenirs with the sentries. "Souvenir," said one of them one day. "Bullet, you know, cartouche. Comprenez?" A French poilu of territorials, who had been dozing, sat up with a grin and said, "Mais oui, mon vieux," and felt in his pouch for a cartridge, and then in his pockets, and then in the magazine of the rifle between his knees. "Fini," he said. "Tout fini, mon petit camarade." The Germans one day made a pounce on Fries, that little village in the loop of the Somme, and pinched every man of the French garrison. There was the devil to pay, and I heard it being played to the tune of the French Soixante Quinzes slashing over the trees. Vaux and Curlo went the way of all French villages in the zone of war when the battles of the Somme began, and were blown off the map.
This concludes the 4th part of 18 total of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.